So good evening, Taoiseach, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. It is a huge honour for me to address you here this evening on the 50th anniversary of the American Chamber. And what a 50 years they have been. This half-century has seen Ireland make the remarkable journey from pre-industrial economy to post-industrial society, withstanding all the attendant upheavals and shocks along the way. And I think it's appropriate on this occasion to look back over those years and to reflect on how Ireland has transformed itself and been transformed over that time, and to look at how we got to where we are today. I also think it's not just appropriate, but absolutely necessary to look beyond all the tales of doom and gloom and bond markets and bailouts, and to look at the very real good news coming out of the Irish economy, and to consider how it can point the way to recovery and to better times for all of us. But first, let's cast our mind back to Ireland of 50 years ago. And Joanne has already brought us through some of the changes since that time. To say Ireland was a very different place in 1961 would be a huge understatement. RTE TV, for instance, didn't start broadcasting until New Year's Eve of that year. And just as Ireland was opening this electronic window onto the world, we were also opening our doors to foreign investment from the rest of the world and from the United States in particular. At that time, on the world stage, President John F. Kennedy had made his inaugural address. And in January of that year, he proclaimed that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century. Something very similar was happening here in Ireland. Eamon de Valera was president and Sean O'Mass was Taoiseach. The state was still being led by two of its founders. But that was very understandable in a country that was around 40 years old at the time. And what happened in the early 60s was the passing of the torch to a new generation of Irish men and women who themselves were children of the new state. This was at least in part a reaction to what might be called the lost decade of the 1950s. This was the decade which saw more than 40,000 people immigrate each year, and our national debt more than treble. It sounds pretty familiar right now. I myself, actually, I was born in London to Irish parents who both immigrated at the end of the 1950s in search of work. They met over there, they got married, and they returned in the 60s, bringing me back with them, obviously. So while the 1950s may be called the lost decade, it was also the decade which saw the seeds of future success and prosperity being sown. The first significant step back then was taken at the beginning of the decade with the establishment of the Industrial Development Authority, known as the IDA. However, the new agency was initially hampered by 1930s legislation which restricted foreign ownership of companies in Ireland. The beginnings of the subsequent regional development policy were also seen at that time with the setup of An Foras Tionscail, which was established to provide grant funding to companies for the purchase of land, buildings and equipment to companies that were setting up in underdeveloped parts of the country. Of even more significance, possibly, was the Export Profits Tax Relief, which came into play in 1956. This effectively exempted from tax, corporation tax, profits generated from exports, and that really was the forerunner to our current rate, 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is getting a lot of attention right now and which remains a crucially important part of our economy. Another major event at that time was the signing by the Irish government of an agreement with the United States, giving guarantees against the expropriation of the investments of US citizens and against banning of the reconversion of their earnings into dollars. When combined with the relaxation of restrictions on foreign ownership of Irish-based companies in 1958, this was the equivalent of putting out the welcome mat for US investment in Ireland. But the most important single event of the decade was probably the publication in 1958 of the study of our special guest here tonight, Dr. T.K. Whitaker. Titled Economic Development, the study is widely regarded as marking the beginning of the upturn in the Irish economy at the time. The newly formed Lemass government began implementation of Dr. Whitaker's recommendations in 1959 with its first programme for economic expansion. This represented an almost complete policy U-turn with an emphasis firmly placed on free trade rather than protectionism, encouragement of foreign investment, and more expenditure on productive investment. With a weak and uncompetitive industrial base, after years of protectionism, opening up to foreign investment would bring opportunity and skills to build a modern industrial base. An early milestone in this new policy departure came on July 31st, 1961, when Ireland applied to become a member of the EEC for the first time. While this application was vetoed by France in 1963, it indirectly led to the setup of the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement in 1965, which gave a much-needed boost to Irish industry at the time and opened up the British market to Irish companies. These were indeed interesting times, and what characterized them was a national trait which we now recognize as innovation. Innovation is in our blood. Whether it's in the arts, or industry, or scientific research, we are good at innovation. Even in the 1950s, we were quietly innovating, developing the structures and tax policies which would prove so valuable decades later. At a time when US firms were expanding rapidly worldwide, tax incentives then, as now, were key to attracting foreign direct investment to Ireland. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the world's first duty-free shop was set up in Shannon Airport in 1951. And one of the world's first duty and tax-free zones for industry was set up in Shannon in 1959. By the mid-1960s, economic growth in Ireland had grown to a respectable 4%. There were several hundred companies, foreign companies operating here, many of them American and all members of the American Chamber at the time. At that time, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson was speaking of the white heat of the new technological revolution. This was a new challenge for Ireland. When we look back on those days, we have to recognise that our proposition to investors was a mix of low tax, grants and cheap labour. We were really, in effect, a low-cost location for manufacturing. It was therefore with a strong sense of pride as an Irish person that I can say, even those far-off days, we saw what was coming and anticipated future events. Of all the investments and innovations in the country in the 1960s, possibly the most important and most meaningful was the introduction of free second-level education. This was the foundation stone on which we developed the highly skilled and talented workforces, world-renowned, and that we have today. Politicians come in for a amount of criticism, none more so than now. But I think the country should acknowledge the tremendous work done by successive ministers of education of all political hues for fighting the corner to protect our education system and to grow our education system, despite the prevailing economic conditions at the time. The 1970s and 80s weren't particularly kind to Ireland in economic terms, yet our education spending was not just maintained, but it even increased. And actually, a statistic I heard recently, our participation rate in third-level education increased practically every year from 1970 to the end of the 20th century. I think this is a tremendous tribute to the foresight of all the people involved during those years. The spirit of innovation that I referred to earlier is very much in evidence in this building. If somebody had told you 25 years ago that there would be a state-of-the-art convention centre on this very ground where I'm standing and you're sitting, you'd have gotten some pretty funny looks. Dublin's docklands back then were pretty much derelict wastelands back in the mid-1980s. It might seem hard to believe now, but the most common description for central Dublin at the time was dead after dark. Again, innovation came to the rescue. Some forward-looking thinkers saw the potential for Ireland as how global regulation of capital markets was driving rapid expansion of the financial services sector. The government bought into the strategic vision of an international financial services centre and supported it with innovative tax and other policies. The willingness to innovate and take a leap of faith paid off handsomely. Today, the IFSC is a globally recognized location for a range of internationally traded financial services, which supports 20,000 jobs. But this took more than just tax policy changes and the availability of suitable property. It required availability of the right people. And talent was the key to the economic boom of the 1990s. If there ever was a golden decade in the Irish economic history, it was the 1990s. That was a decade when all the hard work of the previous 30 years and more started to pay real dividends. That was the decade when, instead of looking at our well-educated youth pack up their degrees in their bags and head overseas for jobs, we started putting out the signs to attract them back home. We've heard much in recent years about perfect storms causing havoc in the financial markets. We had an opposite effect back then here in Ireland. Our perfect storm came in a positive sense when our taxation policies, our talent, and our competitiveness all came together to make us a global location of choice for a new wave of high-tech, knowledge-based companies in the medical devices sector, the pharmaceutical sector, the electronics sector, and the software sector. It seemed as though almost overnight, the endemic unemployment and social problems of the 1970s and 80s had been eliminated. For the first time in our history, we had pretty much full employment and actually a net migration of people to meet the demand for labour. This was indeed, to paraphrase Mr. Lamass, a case of a rising tide which lifted all boats. The regions too benefited from this upturn and inward investment. My own Western region became home to a very significant cluster of globally leading in medical technology companies and IT companies, and indeed the other regions also saw significant growth in particular sectors. But success brings its own problems. No country can go through a period of unprecedented and dramatic growth like we did without having some negative impacts. And there was nothing unusual about the impacts experienced here: high inflation and a consequent erosion of our competitiveness. That's a word we've heard a lot about in the last few years: competitiveness. Our competitiveness relative to other companies diminished rapidly, there's no question about that, and the country got caught in an inflationary spiral. Wages and salaries started chasing price increases, and the ultimate result was inevitable and very costly. While nobody would wish upon any country the plight that has befallen Ireland in recent years, we have to recognise that every cloud has a silver lining, and we have seen some positive aspects to recent events, and among them has been the slow but perceptible recovery in our competitiveness.